You're listening to Two Beers Until Phronesis, a philosophy podcast for students, graduates, and anyone else interested in ideas. In this side series, we explore the history of philosophy and its most notable thinkers, from Socrates to Nietzsche, covering all the big ideas and the ground up. Enjoy!
Yeah, so the Presocratics.
I love a bit of Presocratics. A bit of them.
So you studied did you study any Presocratic stuff at uni? Or
Ages ago. They're like first year. I just thought, since they're the first philosophers ever, it'd be nice to talk about them. They deserve a big shout out.
it's your boy Thales.
Yeah, exactly. So, I just wanted to look back at them because I think they're really important. And I want to work out kind of why they're so important, why these first ever philosophers are important, why they can be considered the first philosophers, whether they can be rightfully considered the first kind of scientists or proto-scientists, or and what sense we can make from those kind of terms, and basically why we should even care at all about a bunch of guys that died thousands of years ago.
Right.
So what reading did you do? Did you read anything?
Not very much at all. I
Great.
like just reading about like Thales or whatever was fine when it was like the philosophy, but I think a lot of it, especially with the Presocratics, it's history and it's sort of like secondary sources of unreliable stuff where you're talking about stuff that Aristotle wrote down about, like Thales, for example, is all that we really have.
Yeah, well, I think that's why they're so interesting, because we only have fragments of what these guys said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's managed to survive, and their influence is still basically being felt. I mean, it's a bit of an over-exaggeration, but Plato is essentially the first philosopher who bothered to write things down, the first big philosopher. Before that, you had Socrates, and Plato taught Aristotle. And so between those three, you kind of get every question, or at least the start of every question that would ever be asked in philosophy. But yet, I think you need to kind of understand those guys in the context that they were writing before, and these Presocratic guys. So that obviously, there's just to call them Presocratic says something. The fact that all these people, like, that must have meant that Socrates changed things significantly. So I think to work out why Socrates changed things so significantly, you kind of have to look at these Presocratics.
Right. Well, to set the scene a bit, so we're sort of talking about like 6th and 7th century BC, sort of around sort of Greece and Western Turkey. I think like people like Thales and whatever were from Ionia, which is now sort of Western Turkey.
Miletus.
But I think part of the problem is like even the term Presocratic, like a lot of philosophers try to avoid using it simply because, I mean, a lot of the philosophers that are grouped into the Presocratic sort of era were actually, some of them were contemporaries of Socrates. You know, a lot of it is more to do with the idea that, and I think the pragmatic way in which it's used is more to do with they're philosophers that were not influenced by Socrates. Or at least they came before Socrates and his Socratic method and all these sorts of things. And I think also a lot of the accounts of them are difficult to know exactly how true they are. I mean, like, some people will say that Pythagoras didn't even exist. He was actually just like a culmination of ideas that sort of became a cult and whatever, and he was became almost more of a mythical figure than an actual, necessarily an individual. And it's difficult to say whether Pythagorean theorem was even actually discovered necessarily by him, or whether the Babylonians got there first, or, you know, whether it was one of his students that, you know, wrote a lot of this down, because again, there's not very many primary sources. You have like fragments of poems and things.
Sometimes it is literally just one word.
Even like words written down by some of these individuals, but most of it, like you said, sort of came through Aristotle and Plato later on, who were writing down stuff and accounts of these people and probably, you know, exaggerating them. They became a lot of, you know, they're sort of like legend.
I think that's what's so powerful about these guys in terms of the ideas they represent. And so what you mentioned, like, we don't know exactly who's who and whether some of these people really existed, but I think that's obviously true of Jesus and Siddhartha Gautama and Buddha.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make them any less compelling or interesting, or say that we can't say things about them. And Socrates is kind of another one that almost falls into that category, because he never wrote anything down, so we don't really have much of an understanding of what he's like.
Right.
How much are we talking about Socrates, and how much are we talking about Plato writing after him?
Right. And also, you know, them sort of idolizing Socrates as he was one of their teachers, you know.
Yeah.
How much do they sort of play up to the stuff like the death of Socrates, like how much is that them just going, yeah, Socrates was such a lad, he just didn't didn't care at all, the whole time during his trial or whatever. Like, how much is that true, and how much is that sort of played up to their idea of this idealized sort of version of Socrates that was ended up being written down? And I think a lot of that does apply to the Presocratics, where it's like maybe a lot of these ideas weren't necessarily entirely attributed to these individuals. But it's kind of, that's the kind of the way history has fallen, and sort of these individuals become associated with the ideas that they came up with, which is it's a fine way to group things.
Yeah, I think as a general rule with all these figures, the way to sort of approach it is the burden of proof kind of thing. It's like, well, unless you have a reason to say that wasn't the case, we might as well just assume that most of this stuff was true, because the sources all kind of tell us that it was. But yeah, I think the ideas they represent are probably more interesting than some of the things they said, at least if you take some of those things at face value. Like, a lot of the things we're probably going to talk about are going to seem like nonsense, just as usual, but like actual nonsense, like that the world is made of fire or the world is made of water and things. It's like, well, these are just weird ideas. They're not obviously not true, but I think in terms of the methods they use to try and get to those ideas is what paradigmatically shifted this from earlier mythology and things like that. But yeah, just to set a little bit more context, this is like just a really dynamic, incredible time. Like, Aristotle's not a native Athenian. I think he was from Turkey, but he's definitely a foreigner. It's like the influence of like intellectual conversation is pretty massive on a scale that the world would never see again until maybe the Islamic period, maybe the Enlightenment.
Historically speaking, a lot of this was encouraged by, this was a massive hub of trade across, so many parts of the Mediterranean. I think that enormous amount of trade that was going on was influential in how a lot of these people had loads of fresh ideas sort of knocking about. It was also sort of the point at which the sort of Middle East and the West was kind of joined together, if you like. So you had all these ideas kind of mingling together.
Yeah, I think you mentioned to me the other day, because obviously we did that podcast on Stoicism. You were saying that Stoicism can be seen as an Eastern import.
Yeah, unfortunately, I was not in that podcast.
Yeah.
I told you. I think a lot of the ideas that are attributed to starting in Greece were weirdly like intermingled with so many ideas that were floating around with these trade routes around the time. You could say that there was, some elements of Stoicism were influenced by Eastern ideas, or probably were in many ways, because all these ideas were kind of cross-pollinating around this time,
And this is really, without contention, you can basically say this is the start of Western civilization as we know it, and track the genealogy of all the ideas back to this place, really. So I think that's another reason why it's so important.
A lot of the reason why this is the place where a lot of people start philosophy and start tracing stuff back is because this is the first time we actually have proper records or historical records of individuals. Even though they are secondary sources, it's the first time we kind of got anything written down about anyone who had any kind of ideas in this way. So it's not necessarily to say that there weren't thinkers and some ideas that were occurring beforehand, but it's just the Presocratics were sort of, if not the first people to start writing it down, then at least the first people to have been written about that were starting to think about the universe in a slightly different way. And I suppose we should get on to how their thinking was kind of different to what preceded them.
At first, there's this discipline. They're basically lawyers. They come along and they make arguments for you. They're kind of like rhetoricians who will argue your case, and they make more intellectual arguments. And this is kind of where the analytic side of philosophy comes from. Who am I thinking of? What's the school of thought? Not the Cynics, not the Stoics, not the Epicureans. He's a sophist. Sophism basically starts a lot of these ideas, but through this, I kind of want to use the word secular, but it's basically it doesn't care whether ideas are supernatural or, as they kind of will start to become through this process, naturalistic. Through that kind of argumentation, people start to think, well, maybe this can be applied to make arguments for how the world is.
Right, they were the first attempts to try and come up with some kind of naturalistic explanation for what they were observing in the world, rather than just necessarily myth or using gods to always explain everything. And, in Homer and Hesiod, like, the sort of writing in that era was like, it's all about story, and it's like everything is imbued with gods, and gods are like, sort of like what moves the world and what creates the world and what is causing things to happen in the world in some sense, and they have both control and and it wasn't until you get the first sort of Presocratics that people were starting to go, well, hang on, maybe some elements of the world are actually sort of predictable or have some patterns to them or have some kind of mechanical explanation, like perhaps and many of the Presocratics, starting with, I think one of the earliest, at least one Aristotle considered the very earliest, Thales, when he came to the first person to start making naturalistic explanations for the world.
Yeah, so the fundamental question these guys are trying to work out, it's metaphysical. So what is the world? What's its essence? It's cosmogonical or some word like
cosmogony.
that? Cosmogony. Yeah. I hadn't heard of that word since yesterday. But
it's basically a sort of historical cosmology, I guess, in a way, because it's like essentially that's what they were doing, was they're trying to come up with natural
kind of a telos, kind of like a teleology, but it's more the structure of it's the cause and the structure kind of.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a teleology, because it can be to do with a cause or a purpose, but it's most of the time it's just literally, okay, well, is there a mechanistic explanation for why?
So how it works, as opposed to what its essence is.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So to this question they're trying to answer, and yeah, they are basically the first people to try and do this in a non-religious context. So Hesiod, you mentioned earlier. So when he had a great idea, when he had a poem, he would say it was divine influence. So we was obviously saying, I don't think that's necessarily a proposition. Just trying to work out the fundamental difference between these two, whether the naturalistic explanation and supernatural. I don't think him saying that is necessarily him saying that a God literally existed and literally put the ideas in his head. I think that's just kind of waxing lyrical about the nature of how he was inspired. I think he's just giving a poetical attachment to his inspiration.
I'm not entirely sure. Like I said before, I think the difference between, say, a god being the action in the world and, like, say, a mechanical action in the world was kind of indistinguishable. So it's like whether a god put it in your head, it's like, is he substituting God for what we would just consider the unknown force that is of the unknown force of cause in this instance? Like, is that what inspired him with the poem, or is he more talking about that sort of unknown thing that caused the inspiration, if you like, which is endowed with some kind of spirit or sort of mind?
I think the difficulty is obviously the choice wasn't available to him between these two things. So I think based on the kind of default nature of what he's saying, that he kind of has to say that because there's no alternative. I don't think it's really comparable to the way we would think about naturalism and supernaturalism.
Right.
And I think the Presocratics are the people to really start this distinction and to start disseminating between different ideas and thinking more, why is one idea better than another? Or at least, why can it be argued to be better?
Right.
Yeah.
And sort of like I sort of mentioned before the podcast, like it's also this idea of knowledge not necessarily being trustable, in the sense that a sort of a true belief is different. And I think this is Anaximander, who's one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, who sort of first came up with this idea that there's a difference between knowing something and something actually being a true belief.
Should we give a few examples of some of these pre-Socratics?
I sort of mentioned Thales, who I think is a good place to start, because it's who Aristotle considers.
But he's basically the first philosopher. Yeah, Carl Sagan, late Carl Sagan, also thought he was the first philosopher, and he actually thought he was the first scientist. It's like, it's kind of not really, but okay. Didn't he think the world was made of water?
Yeah. So he was the first person to start going, okay, well, and a lot. There's a common theme for a lot of the pre-Socratics, where a lot of what they're thinking about is, what are things made of, and how do things become, if you like. And so Thales thought, and you'll realise that this was not too uncommon to think about. Well, he thought, well, everything has to sort of be made of something, and he thought that first thing was water, and they called this sort of first thing, or the thing that makes up everything, the arche. It was called the arche, was the thing that makes up all things, and like he thought that all things were just made up of water, but in different forms. So bone and earth and air is water, but just in a different form.
Is that because there's kind of liquid in everything? Was that like
yeah? Well, so Aristotle said in that the reasons why Thales was thinking this is because moisture seems to be part of, it seems to be integral in life. It seems to be integral in, it seems to be imbued in everything. And like your later Presocratics.
What about fire, Nye? That's not made of water.
It's not Paramedes. It's, I think, oh no, it's Empedocles. Okay, so
I don't have anything written down about it.
Yeah, so because there's bloody loads of them, and they're all called Anax something.
Empedocles.
Yeah. So then you start to have more and more people going, well, either so this arche, this idea of this thing that makes up all things, is this one thing, or it's like you had people like Empedocles who thought it was, say, 4 separate elements, so earth, fire, water, air, that made up all things, and you can sort of mix these elements in different ways, and you get different things.
Yeah, and so it's not the substance of what they're saying. It's not that these ideas are taken on their own are good. It's the fact that how they're coming to these ideas through observation and testing and through argumentation. I mean, they're also doing other things at the same time. So Heraclitus, to take an example, he developed the whole writing style of writing in aphorisms,
right,
which is quite interesting.
He was the guy who would go out into the market, go onto the streets in these sort of Turkish markets, and just like say aloud his philosophies and things. And he would often, and I think a lot of the way his stuff is written is through aphorism and rhetoric, in ways that are very engaging, because he sort of developed this through trying to get people's attention.
Socrates' big critique with these ideas is that they were too aloof, because they were thinking about the nature of reality, but not thinking about how to live a good life. Although that is a caricature, because philosophy is credited as I can't remember who says it, I think someone much later, Zeno or someone, he says that he was the one who pulled philosophy down from the sky and brought it into the legal dimension, the public social dimension, and got real people talking about real questions. But I think that's kind of untrue. Even from the fragments, we know that they were also kind of interested in this idea of how to live a good life. But it's the method that really set the stage. Do you know much about Zeno? You're probably best to explain the whole paradox.
Yeah, even if you want me to explain it. But I mean, like, to take that tangent on, like, a lot of people sort of identify the Presocratics as not... So the reason why they say pre-Socratic is because Socrates was influential in that a lot of people say, well, he's one of the first people to start really talking about ethics and talking about the way people should live. But that's not strictly true, because a lot of the Presocratics did think about ways, but they're just normally identified as just being concerned with, the fundamental nature of things, being the first metaphysicians, if you like. Yeah, so like Democritus, for example, well known, and many people's. I think probably my favourite pre-Socratic philosopher as well, just like Atoms guy, or at least known for being the guy to first come up with the idea of there being some indivisible unit that makes up all things.
He's known as the laughing philosopher.
Yeah,
He's you can see him on the School of Athens painting, and he's pissing himself because
No, I wonder where that's from. Is that just because he
was just really cheerful? He used to use like kind of irony and ridicule, and to in part of his arguments. So like how Heraclitus would use aphorisms, this guy would basically just laugh at people and kind of use that in his stuff. He's basically an optimist in the biggest sense of the word. He's apparently a really cheery guy.
Well, I mean, he was considered a polymath and an absolute genius. And the more you sort of see how some of the fun, he was also one of the first people to really start to distinguish mind and matter. I think, Anaximander was probably the first one, but he was the first one to sort of, I think it was the idea that the world has a naturalistic explanation, but in our phenomenal world is a separate thing, in the sense that he was the first one to sort of, almost like this Cartesian dualism, that nothing becomes real until it sort of interacts with our mind, if you like. But he also thought that the world existed separate of that as well. Yeah,
he's really grounded. You can see a lot of Aristotle coming through, and a lot of that. He's definitely the most materialistic, the most the most non metaphysical kind of all these pre-Socratics. Plato actually hated him so much he wanted all of his books burned. But just as a side to show you how influential these guys really are. Like Democritus was on Greek money, drachmas, for a long time.
Really?
Yeah. So these guys aren't just random niche people. Like they almost still have a cultural influence today.
No, that's amazing. Because I also want to say, like, one of this is a very interesting quote from Democritus, but he said 2,000 years before Shakespeare, "The world is a stage, life an entrance. You came, you saw, you went away." And I actually prefer that to the Shakespeare version of the quote, if you like.
Everyone's a player. Yeah, it's like, yeah,
exactly. No. Like it just was like he was an absolute OG for so many of these really interesting ideas. And I think the more I sort of was reading about Democritus, I was like, oh wow, a lot of like these really important ideas that would actually come up, you know, a thousand or more years later, and be explored again, were really sort of like the seeds of that were starting with Democritus.
He didn't even believe in a prime mover. He didn't even believe in any kind of deity, even just a designer one. So that's incredibly naturalistic.
So we mentioned Zeno, and I think there's plenty of pre-Socratic philosophers to mention. I don't know if there's any particular ones you want to give a shout out to my boy Zeno.
Yeah. Well, I just like the idea of Zeno's paradox.
Where was it in Italy? Because he's from who else is from there?
Parmenides is from there, but I don't know where it is.
Zeno was very influenced by Parmenides, because if you you can that place, I can't remember what the place, the bloody town's called now. Yeah, you see, then you have thinkers like Parmenides who are sort of coming along going, nah mate, nothing is true in a sense. Like he was much more this guy who was sort of like, well, everything is kind of in flux. I believe it was he the guy who sort of like, if you step into a river, you can never step into a river twice, or is that
that's Heraclitus?
That's Heraclitus.
Talks about flux and I don't think he actually said the river thing. I think that's something that's been attributed to him.
Right. Okay.
Because I don't think he would have even thought you could step into a river once, because it's not a river, it's everything.
And you're not ever consistent identity, and this sort of thing. And I think
Parmenides. Parmesan.
Because I always when I read the name of, I still do this with Socrates, where I see the word Socrates and my brain goes Socrates.
Yeah, Socrates. Sophocles.
So Empedocles was all about flux and movement and change, and then Parmenides was more like, well, nothing kind of changes, everything is like just static and doesn't do anything, because nothing is necessarily true in some sense, because sort of his axiom that would come to influence a lot more pre-Socratics later on. That from nothing comes nothing.
So did Zeno invent the idea of paradoxes? I think he did, didn't he?
I don't know. I don't necessarily think so.
I think he uses the example of baldness. It's like, when would you say a person starts to become bald? Is it when they have one hair on their head? Well, no, because they're still bald at that point. So it is a little bit like the broom that changes handle and brush. Is it still the same broom?
Yeah, the ship of Theseus.
Yeah, Theseus' ship.
Yeah, and I think, again, like even Descartes talked about this with this idea of consistent identity, where it's like, at what point, Descartes uses the example of a candle in Meditations, where he talks about, at what point is the wax, when the wax is melting, does the candle become just a pool of wax? At what point is it a candle? At what point is it just a pool of wax? And, this goes way back to sort of Zeno and a lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers who started talking about the consistency of identity.
So why do you think that's an interesting idea? Why is that even important to even talk about?
Well, it's obviously it's interesting because it's talked about, are the conceptions of identity, is identity an actual thing, or is it just some like emergent concept that we have like very vague ideas about, but it isn't, but things don't necessarily have an actual set identity in some sense. It's incredibly interesting because I think Zeno is one of these people who because he was influenced by Parmenides, a lot of his paradoxes were intended to try and get away from this idea that things were real in a sense, because he would use stuff like Zeno's paradox, which we'll explain in a sec, to try and sort of erode away this idea that things being as they seem. So Zeno's paradox, for example, is the idea, so if you half the distance between something, then half it again, then half it again. So say if you're about to clap your hands, what you're doing when you're clapping your hands is you're halving the distance between your hands each time. So I'm going like half the distance, a fourth of the distance, an eighth of the distance, 16th, etc., 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 until but do my hands ever contact to clap? If all I'm ever doing is just halving the distance all the time, how do my hands ever clap? And funnily enough, this was actually answered mathematically, like I believe in the 16th century, I think.
Is the arrow in flight basically the same?
Yeah, the idea of arrow in flight is like, does the arrow ever hit its target? Because all the arrow's ever doing is just like halving the distance. Does it ever hit the target if that's all that's ever happening? And what's interesting is this is actually an example of what's called a convergent series. So this is involved, and you can actually explain this mathematically. And funnily enough, if you sum a half plus an eighth plus a 16th plus a 32nd, etc., 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 going on and on, this actually converges to 1. So you actually end up with getting 1 eventually. So funnily enough, mathematically, it actually was sort of explained, or at least as a paradox, it kind of actually was solved. Paradoxes like this, and like you talked about the bald hair problem, where it's like, at what point is someone bald? At what point do they, have hair? Like this idea of identity being consistent, or trying to erode away our ideas about what is real and what isn't, or is what's what we call a thing. Is it the thing we call it, etc. Sort of rooted in what Parmenides started, and sort of Zeno sort of was carrying on a bit with that.
Just to reiterate, these weren't just people coming up with kind of kooky ideas as well. They were actually involved in the community, involved in their culture as well. So like Anaximander was, I always get him confused with Anaxagoras.
Yeah, Anaxagoras, Anaximander,
Anaximandus.
Anaximander, yes, because those are the 3 boys that all have the same name, don't they?
But yeah, like, so this was a guy involved in things like cartography, he was drawing maps, he was working in things like geometry. I mean, Carl Sagan actually says he did the first ever experiment, which is a bit of a bold claim.
Well, I think he was the dry, wet guy. So I think he took like Thales' idea that water is the arche and water is like, and he went, nah. And he sort of went, well, I think that there's actually this thing called the apeiron. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Yes, the fifth element.
Well, it was not just a fifth element. It was the root of all elements. It was sort of like where everything it is the element, and then sort of everything else kind of is made up of this.
So it's an arche.
Yeah, it's a sort of arche, but it's not like one of the elements that we can sort of see. It's sort of like it makes up water, it makes up whatever. And he had this idea that, well, the 2 polar opposites are actually hot and dry. I don't think it was later that it was.
It's the word parsimony. Basically, this kind of reductionist way of trying to get to that underlying cause of things, which is very, very scientific. And obviously, so when Carl Sagan says he did the first experiment, what he's saying is he was the first person we know of to try and establish truth through reliability, repeatability, testing, retesting of evidence, that kind of idea, which, it sounds like, well, surely when people built bridges and things before, this is essentially what they would do. But I think that's something fundamentally quite different.
Anaximandus, it might be, yeah.
I think there's a D in the end, like Mendes.
One of the Anaxi boys, but I think he was one of the first people to actually, as far as experiments are concerned, I remember he also thought that water was the arche, but he actually did an experiment to try and prove it, in the sense that he now used what we obviously call vaporization and condensation to prove that water can become air, and then it becomes a sort of solid thing, and so he thought, well, okay, I can do all these things with water. This is proof, or at least my experiment shows that it can change forms, so it must be the arche.
Yeah, so this is why these ideas aren't science, because that's not what science is, at least as we understand it today. But you can definitely see it's a kind of shadow of science. It's a proto-science. There's some attempt to appeal to evidence, which, just hadn't really been recorded before. So I'd say science in its entirety really starts when you get the scientific method, which I think involves a lot of other things like peer review, and there is a lot of ego in a lot of these ideas, and a lot of...
You can't really say that science ever started at a particular point, because I think, even to take the example of the scientific method, I think the last formalized, written down version of the scientific method that we're still using is probably from a random book in the 1930s that a bloke wrote down. It's the actual scientific method itself is an idea that sort of grew gradually out of and particularly out of the Enlightenment, which was
I think you could probably say the same for all ideas. Take the example of democracy. What the Athenians had wasn't really democracy, because they had slaves and all kinds of things. But in its modern iteration, I think we could say we live in some kind of democratic society. 200 years ago, that idea doesn't exist the same. Pinpointing things is difficult, but I think you can say that science didn't exist in the Dark Ages. It does now. So somewhere along there has been a genealogy of
It
ideas.
didn't just, like,
yeah, I'm
grow
not
up.
saying Copernicus just shat it out of his ass and it just appeared. Yeah,
That's what I mean. It's sort of like, I think it's a common misconception that it's just kind of like the Enlightenment happened, we all just sort of woke up and then everyone started doing science. It's like, well, no, it was like a sort of culmination of different thinkers and ideas, and this gradual sort of easing into more and more reliable methods of empiricism and ways of testing. And then, then Karl Popper comes along and it's like, well, actually, inductive reasoning is it doesn't really work, and like, all this unfalsifiability, and you have all these different sort of thinkers coming and weighing in on how we should do science, what we think science is, as a reliable method of trying to find the truth. But yeah, the genesis of those ideas goes all the way back to the Presocratics, and I think, obviously, it was also not this positivistic curve towards science either. It's not like it's not like we sort of developed culturally or scientifically or philosophically like in a linear upwards fashion. It's like it's been a bumpy road, lost knowledge along the way, and we've gained it different places and in different ways. Discarded different kinds of knowledge. It's not this sort of linear progression.
I think, so while we probably can't say that they're the first scientists for various reasons, I think we pretty much can say they were the first philosophers. Why is that?
The problem is they wouldn't use the word philosopher back then, in the way even Aristotle wasn't.
Well, I think Socrates quite liked the term. Was it philos, lover of wisdom? It was an insult that they kind of took on, a bit like the N word. They kind of empower themselves with using it, I think.
Whether you can call them philosophers or not, it's difficult to sort of say. But
I think I want to kind of separate the historical reality of stuff to how useful these ideas are now in take. So, like, obviously, we obviously said they aren't really the first philosophers, or at least there's a chance they might not be. But I think the idea of them being the first philosophers is useful to us today. I'd say that's when philosophy started, at least. I'd say that without any kind of contention. But yeah, I think, it's this idea that people will start to become interested in answering these specific questions.
It's just the way in which any way of trying to find the truth was formalized just hadn't started yet. So, and the reason why Socrates was so important is because of the Socratic method, the idea of critical thinking, or thinking about things through dialogue and critical discussion. It wasn't like predominant then either. It was like, this idea that, I think it's Heraclitus he's the one who, I think he also was claimed that, all his knowledge just came to him and he was all just like thought everything himself, and everyone else is fucking stupid but me, and I'm amazing, I'm Heraclitus, everyone loves. I was reading about him, I was just like, Christ, this guy had a massive ego. Like, I
think to be doing what they did, they'd have to have some kind of, they literally thought that the world was explainable in their lifetime. And I think, I mean, maybe that was something that people generally felt was the case.
I think people still think that now. I think lots of scientists still think that we're on the verge of a sort of theory of everything, or a paradigm that if we find ways to quantize gravity, a lot of people might say, well, we might be able to quantize gravity in our lifetimes. And obviously that's not an ultimate answer to everything.
Well, I think these are fundamentally different questions. I know you hold this view that a lot of science can answer philosophical questions.
Sometimes it can't. Sometimes it can.
Sometimes it can.
Depends on the nature of the question.
Yeah, and I think there are just some ideas that are categorically in a separate space. They're not quantifiable.
Hume's fallacy. I think there's is and oughts, isn't there?
Yeah.
And science doesn't answer oughts. Yeah, we'll obviously do a podcast on that probably some other time, because
I do actually want to get into that. But so there's also this idea of the Presocratics. They haven't quite disseminated ideas yet. This is really the start of the dissemination and the ordering of thought and ideas and concepts. So that's another reason why perhaps we might say it's not philosophy yet, because a lot of the time they're working with like one idea. Like when we use words like metaphysics and ontology, it's like they kind of just combine everything, and it's like it's like it's natural philosophy. Science is natural philosophy. And then the rest is just all kinds of stuff. And we call it cosmogony now, but they wouldn't have. And it's like what things are, what the nature of being, and then where it comes from, are all just like one big idea. And then that somehow also links into ethics. They don't separate the disciplines. Final question to end on. when we're saying these guys are the first philosophers, where does that leave Eastern thought?
I think the problem is a lot of why we focus a lot on the Presocratics is, like I was saying earlier, it's like that's where our sort of written records, or at least secondary sources for people writing about them, sort of begins. But we have very little. It's so much of this stuff is just predicated on what we know from historical records, and I think we do certainly focus a lot on it in the West, but you could say, well, there's a good reason why we do focus a lot on the Greeks, because like many people say, like it's the foundation of Western civilization. You just got to read Plato or Aristotle. Aristotle and Plato are just sort of like the foundation for what would become Western civilization.
Do you think there's anything fundamentally different about the Buddha? Because he was writing at the same time. Well, not writing, but he was around at the same time as Socrates, roughly.
Well, I think what's interesting about Eastern philosophy is in some ways, and I'm not an expert in Eastern philosophy, but it's interesting to see how a lot of the focus was more internal when it came to Eastern philosophy, whereas the Greeks and the Presocratics were very eager to start trying to answer external questions about the nature of reality, what makes up reality, etc., etc. Whereas a lot of Eastern questions were more about internal questions about our experience, about our phenomenology, about how to live a good life, about about these sorts of ideas, and they sort of went further in trying to develop those than I think the Greeks necessarily did.
Yeah, I think that's largely because some of the Eastern philosophy we think of as philosophy is probably not best described as philosophy in the same sense as the people doing it in the West were doing it. I think the Presocratics really are the start of the analytic tradition, and I think continental philosophy, which is the other side to analytic philosophy, it's a more subjective, almost spiritual understanding of philosophy. I think that's something that's probably a little bit harder to write about and do. And I think it really only starts with existentialism and people like Kierkegaard. And it's quite a bit of a juggle to do that. And I think there's very little space for that more subjective area of philosophy outside of things like existentialism to really operate. So I think when we're talking about Eastern philosophy, because doesn't come from the same place as that analytic stuff, there's two things. I don't want to be like Orientalist and go, oh, that's basically the same thing as what people were doing in the West. So I don't want to go to co-opt all of African thought and go, oh, it's basically the same thing as this. Yeah. But there's also the fact I don't think it is. I think it is basically religion, especially how the people took the ideas of the Buddha later. I think the Buddha and Socrates would have got on. I think they would have shared a pint. But I don't think, at least the way Buddhism has been taken now, I don't think that's anything like philosophy. I think that's an ideology. I don't think it's necessarily that superstitious, at least in some contexts, or at least it doesn't have to be. But I do think it is, unfortunately become an ideology. I don't know much about Taoism and Confucianism, but yeah, I think a lot of the time it's really religion that we're talking about. It just has a lot of the same impact and the same kinds of areas of discussion that philosophy might take on. But I think they're probably different disciplines. Not to say that there isn't philosophy going on in the East that is comparable to the West, but I just think let's hold our horses before we start co-opting that into I think it's probably a good thing that we've separated the two. I think Eastern philosophy has its own place and Western philosophy has its place, because I think if you start blending things too much, you end up with, again, I don't want to compartmentalize things, but I think it's probably a good reason that at least until the modern day, when we can have these kinds of conversations we have more frames of reference to work with. We share more frames of reference, and they're not in certain contexts. This is my podcast. It's all mine.